Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Dennis Stone, and I'm director of the Center for Advocacy and Social Justice at the Jacksonville Urban League. And we're delighted this evening to have with us Paige Pellaton, a professor at the University of North Florida, and actually someone who was an academe out in California at UC Davis and happens to be an old stomping ground for me. But I'll let Analiz Cedeño introduce her. She was responsible for bringing her to our virtual town hall on this very important topic of midterm, let's call it district mapping. So, Annalise, please take it away. Oh, also wanted to introduce Saudia Barge, our coordinator of interns, and we have Nick Shell, who's also on. So thank you.
All right, it's a pleasure to have you guys all here today and have Dr. Paige Pellaton, one of my professors at University of North Florida, here to talk to us about redistricting mid-decade. Dr. Paige Pellaton, as you've already heard, is a professor at UNF now, and she focuses on American politics, especially state legislatures, committees, legislative productivity, political elites, and most importantly, representation. She teaches courses on state and local politics, public policy, and Congress, and she is known for being very energetic and engaging in her classes. She earned her PhD at the University of California, Davis, in Sacramento, and previously worked as an adjunct professor at UC Center in Sacramento. So take it away. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much. I'm very, very appreciative for this opportunity. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Please let me know when you're able to see it.
Yep, we're good.
All right, awesome. So by way of introductions, yes, my name is Paige Pellaton. I am an assistant professor over at the University of North Florida. But today I am here to talk to you about the lines that shape lives. So the redistricting fight that is currently taking place, not just in our state of Florida, but also nationwide in states like Texas, California, and Ohio. So to set the stage, currently all eyes are on April. What I mean there is that in early January, Governor Ron DeSantis called for a special session of the Florida legislature to initiate mid-decade redistricting. So here is the current congressional map from the Florida delegation. You can see we have 28 members to the U.S. House. They're all up for re-election this November. We've got 20 GOP members and 8 Democratic members. Now, usually the filing deadline for the congressional primaries is a little bit earlier in the year. It tends to be in April here in Florida, but we've actually pushed back the filing deadline for the state until mid-June in order to accommodate the potential for a new congressional map. So state lawmakers are going to meet for a 5-day period, Monday, April 20th through Friday, April 24th, in order to do 2 things. The first is to adopt a new congressional map, and the second is to appropriate additional money in the budget for related legal challenges. Now, of course, you might know that we're also about to have another special session with the budget. And so the question might be there, will we have money left over in the current budget negotiations that take place a couple weeks earlier for legal challenges? And that remains to be seen. But the GOP currently controls 68% of the state Senate seats and 70% of the state House seats. But they only need, according to the Florida Constitution, a simple majority to adopt a new U.S. House map for the state. And so we largely expect that the redistricting map will be approved, whatever it eventually looks like, because Florida Republicans control a supermajority of the seats in both chambers of the state legislature. Now, per the Florida House Speaker, Daniel Perez, it is looking like the state legislative districts will remain largely untouched, at least for this upcoming election. It remains to be seen whether or not the state Senate and the state House districts will also be changed, though, for future elections. So for now, we're just dealing with the congressional redistricting. But you might ask, why now? Why are we bothering to do this in 2026? We usually only redistrict once every 10 years after the federal U.S. Census enumerates the people, reassigns how many seats to the House of Representatives each state gets, and then the state legislatures are responsible for redistricting for those congressional seats. So mid-decade redistricting is unusual, but it is legal under the federal Constitution. Weaponizing these redistricting maps, though, is a pretty unusual experience here. So in early last summer, 2025, President Donald Trump encouraged Texas Republicans to redistrict early, so ahead, in advance, rather than waiting for the 2030 census, in order to protect the GOP's very narrow majority that they currently have in the U.S. House of Representatives. They are sitting at 218 seats to the Democrats' 214 seats. So they're hoping to hang on to that majority in the November 2026 election, when all 435 members of the House are up for re-election. Now, the Texas Republicans in Texas ended up responding by adopting a new map that ended up adding potentially 3 seats to the Republican majority. But California then retaliated in November of 2025 and adopted their own map that added an additional 5 blue seats. So Texas and California effectively offset each other in this first step of the redistricting wars. So that's a net zero gain for both political parties. But other states now have started to jump into what I think can be called the redistricting wars. So the expected GOP gains include Ohio, which redistrict, adding 2 potential seats for the Republican Party, North Carolina, that redistrict, adding 1 potential red seat, Missouri also added 1. But there are also some Democratic offsets at the same time. So for example, voters in Virginia are expected to add an additional 4 potential Democratic or blue-leaning seats. So again, we have a lot of offsetting here that's happening across the nation. I should note, though, that other states have also chosen to decline to participate in this redistricting mid-decade. So there are some GOP holdout states, like the Republican majority in Indiana and the Republican majority in Kansas, have decided not to participate in this mid-district redistricting ahead of the 2026 November elections. And then you have some Democratic holdouts as well. Illinois, which is a democratically controlled state, has declined to participate. They thought perhaps maybe they would pass a map that would add 3 blue seats. Indiana, though, decided to not participate in the redistricting wars, and so Illinois also decided to sit out this time around. Maryland thought maybe they would add 1 blue seat, but it's looking like that bill is stalling in the Maryland State Senate. And then New York and Colorado are actually too late to join the redistricting wars. Their primary filing deadlines for new congressional candidates has already passed, and so they won't be able to participate ahead of the 2026 midterm elections, even if they wanted to in their state legislatures. So why exactly is Florida joining the fray? So Florida, and specifically Governor DeSantis, in issuing this proclamation calling for this redistricting session, has cited 2 particular reasons that Florida might want to redistrict ahead of 2026. The first one is that Governor DeSantis has repeatedly criticized the 2020 census. He has argued that the 2020 census, because of delays in the census counting, because it was running during a peak COVID-19 year, Florida was undercounted, is what he argues, by about 750,000 or so residents. Now, currently, that would have meant if Florida was undercounted or had been properly counted, that would have meant Florida would have gained 2 House seats. Instead, we only ended up gaining 1 House seat. Additionally, Governor DeSantis is saying that certain population shifts, so where people are moving in from other parts of the country, but also where people are moving across the state, also potentially justifies a new congressional map ahead of 2026. So here is a map showing the change in Florida population from 2020 to 2022. You can see that parts of the state in the north and in the south have actually declined or decreased in their population size. But you can also see that there are some really heavy gains, especially to the central and southwest of the state. Places around Tampa and Orlando have gained a lot of people, sometimes as much as 5% of the state's population in those specific counties. So Governor DeSantis is arguing that this gives us reasonable justification to want to start to redistrict ahead of the congressional elections in the fall because enough people have shifted around across the state to justify it. But there's also a second major reason that he has cited in his executive order calling for this special session. And the big one is that the Supreme Court of the United States might soon be reshaping the Voting Rights Act. We'll talk about this in detail in just a moment, but right now the Supreme Court is debating the constitutionality of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. So historically, the Supreme Court has ruled that using race to harm or dilute minority voting power is unconstitutional. You're not allowed to draw districts in such a way that is going to disenfranchise or harm the ability of minority voters, of Black or Hispanic voters to be able to elect candidates of their choice. We know that that's unconstitutional. The question on the table right now, though, with the current Supreme Court case that's to be decided this summer, is whether or not you're allowed to use race to protect minority voters. So currently, this is up for debate in the Supreme Court. Are we allowed to draw districts in such a way that protects the ability of Black and minority, Asian and Hispanic voters to be able to elect candidates that potentially look like them or at least substantively represent those communities of color? I should note as well, though, that the Supreme Court has ruled back in 2019 that while racial gerrymandering to cause harm to minority communities is unconstitutional, partisan gerrymandering is actually legal federally. It is a constitutional practice. Now, it's technically banned in the Florida State Constitution, but nationwide, partisan gerrymandering is not something that the Supreme Court has been comfortable with striking down in the past. So, redistricting in the Florida State Constitution. You might remember that back in 2010, the voters of Florida passed the Fair Districts Amendment of 2010. This was a constitutional amendment that voters approved in pretty overwhelming fashion. So voters opted for two things. They opted for more political neutrality in their maps, and they opted to protect minority representation in redistricting in the state's constitution. So voters at the time opted, we wanted no partisan gerrymandering, so we weren't going to draw congressional and state legislative districts that would favor the Republican or the Democratic Party or vice versa. We also opted for no incumbent gerrymandering, meaning we weren't going to redistrict in such a way that protects the people that are already currently in office. As Florida voters, we also voted, though, that we were not going to draw maps that would harm the ability of those racial minority or linguistic minority communities, so for example, predominantly Spanish-speaking communities, from electing representatives of their choice. This is what's known as the non-discrimination clause. Voters at the time also opted for more geographic integrity in their maps, except if preempted by federal law. So unless the geographic integrity were, say, to run afoul of the Voting Rights Act or the 14th Amendment. For example, Florida voters wanted districts to be contiguous and compact. Contiguous refers to every part of the district touching another part of the district, and compact refers to not drawing sprawling districts that would sprawl across the state, but instead making districts as geographically tight as possible. Another thing Florida voters approved was that districts should be roughly equal population size. That's about 770,000 residents per district in the state of Florida and nationwide. Florida voters also requested that districts be respectful of existing municipalities and geographic boundaries where possible. So the goal here being that we want to try not to split the city of Jacksonville into multiple congressional districts, or we want to try and keep the core of Miami in a single district rather than breaking them up. Additionally, we want to use the natural geography of the state as natural district borders. So, for example, in Florida, we use the intercoastal waterway to break up the 4th and the 5th districts in the state. And lastly, Florida voters set out in the Fair Districts Amendments of 2010 that no single redistricting principle should take precedence over another principle in the Constitution. So we can't sacrifice compactness in order to make sure that we're following the non-discrimination clause, or we can't sacrifice municipal respect or political integrity in order to achieve contiguity in our maps. We have to sort of redistrict, keeping all of these principles in mind as priorities. No one principle is allowed to take preeminence or precedence over the other principle. Now, you might remember, though, as Jacksonville voters, as Jacksonville residents, the 2022 redistricting controversy that happened in North Florida. So after the 2020 census, Florida only ended up gaining one additional U.S. House seat. And so the state legislature passed a new congressional map, but Governor DeSantis ended up vetoing that map and calling for a special session, a special redistricting session. So in that special redistricting session, Florida went from having 16 reliably red districts to having 20 reliably red districts. The most impacted areas with this new congressional map that had been approved were North Florida, Central Florida, Tampa Bay, and South Florida. So most importantly to Jacksonville, here in blue on the left-hand side is the Florida 5th. It previously stretched from Tallahassee to Jacksonville, and it contained a population of 46.2% Black voters across that northern strip of the state, who consistently reelected Representative Al Lawson, a Democrat, for 3 terms, or 6 years, while this map was still in play. But you can see in the new redistricting, that blue district, the Florida 5th, was actually redrawn, and it was cracked apart and separated into 4 different Florida districts in the north of Florida. So districts 2, 3, and then the districts containing Jacksonville, districts 4 and 5. And so under these new 2022 maps, these voters were redistributed to these 4 separate districts. And in none of the 4 new districts is the population of Black voters exceeding 32%. So this was considered at the time by critics of this new map a dilution of Black voting power in the state. Now, this then brought on a number of legal challenges. One legal challenge actually stretched for 3 years and was only decided recently back in 2025. And so this legal challenge brought questions up towards the Florida Supreme Court. 2 questions being, did this new map violate the non-diminishment clause in Florida? If you recall, the non-diminishment clause says you're not supposed to draw a map that prohibits racial or linguistic minorities from being able to elect a representative of their choice. And if this new map violated the non-diminishment clause, what could we actually do about it now that the map had actually been passed into law by the Florida legislature in 2022? So in that ruling that we just received last year, the state Supreme Court ruled that yes, the court acknowledged that the state legislature's 2022 map might have violated the state's constitution's non-diminishment clause by reducing Black voting power in the north of Florida. But the problem being is that the state Supreme Court did not see a constitutionally legitimate way to remedy the situation and return that voting power to Black voters in North Florida. So to fix it, the state would have to prioritize race in redrawing the district map. And prioritizing race in redrawing the map would be a violation of the federal Equal Protection Clause that's enshrined in the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. So therefore, the Florida State Supreme Court says, yes, we recognize that this might have been a dilution of Black voting power in the North Florida with the abolishment or dissolvement of Florida's 5th, but there's no real constitutional fix, because to fix it, we'd have to prioritize race. And the state constitution says we're not allowed to do that, as well as the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And as a result, the 2022 map is going to stand. So that's one constitutional challenge we've seen to Florida's maps in the last 10 years. The second constitutional challenge, though, has to do with the Voting Rights Act on a federal level. So in 2022, the Louisiana State Legislature drew a majority-minority map, the district, that stretched from Shreveport to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in order to protect the power of Black voters. Now, a majority-minority district, for context, is a district in which at least 50% of the voters are racial or ethnic minorities. In this case, you can see that district is the district in red on the map presented to you. And so it's a very funky, not at all compact district, but it does have a district or contains a district of at least 50% Black voters in the state. So currently, the Supreme Court is debating in Louisiana versus Calais. They're debating whether or not states can consider race in order to protect minority voters. Remember, states are not allowed to redistrict in a way that harms minority voters. But the question under consideration right now is, are states allowed to draw districts in a way that protects the vote of minority voters, like this funky looking 6th district in Louisiana? So the legal tension is really between the US Constitution and the Voting Rights Act, which is a federal statute passed by Congress back in 1965. The 14th Amendment says that states should not be drawing maps where race is the predominant factor, the predominant consideration. That's meant, in theory, to protect Black voters. But Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act says that states should not draw maps that effectively deny the right of minority voters a fair chance to elect their candidate of choice. So very much like the non-diminishment clause in the Florida State Constitution. So the overarching question right now is whether or not Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is unconstitutional. And if the Supreme Court rules before the end of its session in July that Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is unconstitutional, that's going to have major consequences for the maps nationwide, including in the state of Florida, which is what Governor Ron DeSantis is potentially reacting to, or preempting, I should say, with this special session. So there are major consequences nationwide, but I'll focus on the consequences potentially that we could see in the South. So the New York Times estimates that the Republican Party could gain up to 12 different red seats in the South if the Section 2 of the VRA is ultimately struck down. So here's the current House map in the South. You can see there are smatterings of blue districts, still predominantly a red region of the country, but there are still blue districts, especially in some of these urban cores of these southern states. But here is the potential worst case scenario for the Democratic Party in the South, a plausible redistricting scenario where Republicans gain 12 seats, including 9 without Section 2 of the VRA. So this is sort of the worst case scenario if you are a Democratic advocate here in the South. State Republicans, though, might not be completely on board with dismantling these blue districts. So some Democratic districts in the South are actually drawn in funky ways, like you might see that Louisiana district is drawn in a really funky way, partially to keep certain Republican incumbents safe. This is what's known as packing. So you put all of the Democratic voters, especially in an urban core, in 1 or 2 or just a handful of districts, and that makes all of the surrounding suburban and rural communities safer Republican seats. So if we were to dilute the voting power of some of these blue districts in the South, it would mean that some of those Republican districts in the suburbs become more competitive as a result. The other reason why GOP lawmakers in the southern legislatures might be uncomfortable with going all the way towards towards that lower map is because state lawmakers also face different political pressures than members of Congress do. And so it might be a harder political sell to voters in the long run. But the filing deadline in 22 states has already passed as of today at 5 p.m. And so that means that the decision's immediate impact will be smaller in 2026 than it will be in 2028. And still, it's unclear if the Supreme Court will settle this Voting Rights Act case by the time that the Florida special session to redistrict convenes on April 20th. So looking ahead, then, to Florida's special session. What are we working with? Who is most vulnerable, then? Of the 8 Democratic members in Congress currently that we send to the U.S. House of Representatives, who is most vulnerable to potentially losing their seat or facing a much tougher re-election challenge in November 2026? Now, observers estimate that it could be between 2 seats and 5 seats. It seems unlikely, especially the way that Miami and Miami-Dade counties are currently drawn. It seems unlikely that the Florida GOP will do away with all 8 of Florida's blue seats, but it could be as few as 2 and as many as 5 seats that the Democratic delegation ends up losing. These estimates are based on both seat safety, so how swingy or how purple is your district, as well as population growth. So if the Florida GOP is using this argument about different areas of the state picking up more new residents than other areas of the state, that is also going to hinder their ability to respect the equal population requirement by the Florida State Constitution. Remember, the Florida State Constitution requires that each district be roughly the same population size. So the most vulnerable districts, in Florida are the Central Florida Democrats. So that refers to Representative Darren Soto, a Democrat from Osceola in the Florida 9th, as well as Representative Maxwell Frost, the Democrat from Orlando in the Florida 10th. You might also recognize Representative Maxwell Frost because he's the first Gen Z member of Congress. And so here are their 2 districts. So Darren Soto, or Representative Soto, represents that sort of yellow district in the south in Osceola, and then Representative Frost represents that pink district, District 10, that represents the bulk of Orlando there. So the likely outcome for these 2 Democrats is that they will somehow be forced to face off in the August primary, that the legislature here in Florida will find a way to separate those 2 populations and to collapse them into a single district, thereby forcing these 2 fairly popular incumbents in their districts to face off against one another in the August primaries. Then you also potentially are going to see an imperiled Representative Kathy Castor, who's a Democrat out of Tampa/St. Pete in the Florida 14th. So Representative Castor's safety is probably going to weaken if St. Petersburg is folded back into the Pinellas County, Florida 13th, which used to be a very highly competitive county. So prior to the 2022 redistricting, the Pinellas County and St. Pete were actually all of one district, and it was a hyper-competitive district between Democrats and Republicans. But after the 2022 redistricting cycle, St. Pete was moved to be into a district with Tampa. And you might ask, well, Tampa and St. Pete don't geographically or physically connect with one another, so does that violate the Florida State Constitution's requirement for contiguity between 2 parts of the district? And actually, there are 2 highway systems that connect St. Pete and Tampa, so that's how we're able to say that St. Pete and Tampa are geographically connected in some fashion. So it's possible that the Republican Party may choose to redistrict St. Petersburg back into Pinellas County, making Tampa a slightly less safe district, but really maybe putting that Pinellas County or the Pinellas District 13 to the left a little bit more in play than it currently is. But the other more vulnerable districts are absolutely those remaining South Florida districts. They're also quite vulnerable. So we're talking about Representative Loie Frankel from Florida's 22nd, and Jared Moskowitz from Florida's 23rd, both coastal Democrats. We're also talking about Representative Debbie Wasserman Schultz, as well as Representative Frederico Wilson. Debbie Wasserman Schultz is a very high-profile Democratic incumbent. She was at one point in time the chair of the DNC when President Obama was in power. And so you can see these coastal Democrats are also quite vulnerable to the potential of losing their seats or facing tougher general elections. I should note, though, that perhaps the safest Democratic seat in Florida from the U.S. House congressional delegation is probably Florida's 20th. That's Representative Sheila Sherphillis McCormick. She's a Democrat there in that purple district on the western side of the map, and she might be the safest of the Democrats in this redistricting cycle because her district is already quite large in nature. So it'll be harder to distribute her voters in a way that's going to harm her vote share in the fall. But in shifting Democratic voters into Republican districts, the Florida Republican Party also has to be very careful because they risk creating more competitive swing districts in the north and in the south. So for example, Representative Frankel, who represents that pink district, District 22 in the middle of the Atlantic coast here, her district was won with 55% of the vote in 2024. Just above her is a Republican-held district. That's Republican Representative Mast, and he won the Florida 21, that bright green district, with 62% of the vote in 2024. So, for example, if the Florida legislature were to redistrict her district slightly and put some of those District 22 voters into District 21, you do potentially risk making District 21 more competitive for the Republican Party come the November election. But the goal here would potentially be taking districts 22, 23, 25, and 24 and finding a way to potentially crack them to weaken the safety of those districts in the Miami and North Miami areas. Now, I'll make two last comments about how this actually works. So how do we gerrymander at the state legislative level? There's two methods, and one is called cracking and the other method is called packing. And so I'm going to show you, or I'm showing you, two ways in both Texas and in California that the Republican Party in Texas managed to swing a district for the Republican congressional delegation, and the California legislature managed to also flip some districts in the state of California. So on the left-hand side is what we call cracking. You can see that the blue district, sort of outlined in sharp blue, is the old district. This was a Democratic stronghold in the sort of outer core of Dallas. Now, those voters, though, have been redistricted into this new Republican district that is much more Republican in nature. It's much more sprawling and suburban in nature, so it's a more safely Republican area. So Dallas Democrats were removed from this safe Democratic district and redrawn into a new Republican-friendly district next door. And remember, constitutionally, as long as this is based on partisanship and not based on race, this is constitutionally protected by the federal government and by the Supreme Court. On the other hand, you have what's known as a method called packing. This is when you take your opponents, your opposing political party's voters, and you mash them or you pack them into as few districts as possible. So you can see that those new districts where you've packed those voters are going to be less competitive for your party, more safe for your opponent's party, but you've also taken away the surrounding competitiveness of those surrounding districts. So this is what California Democrats did in their state last November. They took rural Republicans that had been crammed into, or had been spread out, I should say, across the state, and they crammed them into just a handful of districts in Southeast California. Now, as a reminder, Florida's state constitution prohibits us from partisan gerrymandering outright. That, however, doesn't protect from the potential to change the population size in a given district or to change the contiguity and compactness of a given district. It's possible that there might be arguments, like in Tampa, that this district is no longer considered contiguous, and as a result, we have the ability to potentially redistrict it. We might say that Florida's 10th or Florida's 9th are no longer have since violated the one person, one vote, the equal population requirement, and as a result, we can see them breaking them up or breaking them apart in time for the primary season. Okay, that is all I have for you today. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with the Jacksonville Urban League. I very much appreciate it. And my email address is available there if you have any questions you'd like to address with me offline. But otherwise, I am really looking forward to our discussion. Thank you so much.
Analiz, are you going to moderate the questions?
Yes, of course. That was a great presentation. Thank you so much. Now we'll open up the floor to any questions. To get things started, I have one. I'm going to choose from a selection because I made quite a few while you were speaking. Let me see. So I guess I wanted to talk about the implications of the voting. So you spoke about how redistricting would affect incumbent Democrats in their districts. But I'm wondering, how might redistricting influence voter turnout or the trust in the government in those states like or in those cities like Orlando or Tampa that have that Democratic majority.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first and foremost, I think the big danger, if you are a Democratic strategist, is the fear that people will get confused about where to vote and who they're voting for. But you also have the fear that you're going to have really strong incumbent Democrats possibly facing off against one another in the primary. So in Florida, we have closed political primaries, so only one member of a political party can be on the ballot come November. I think you have the potential fear that not only will Democratic voters be potentially confused about who they're voting for, because when you have two incumbents on a ballot, it doesn't send a really strong signal about which incumbent is going to be stronger for you in the general election. But you also might then be losing out on enthusiasm for some of these incumbents as well when voters show up in November and realize that the incumbent they're used to is no longer on the ballot. So that can definitely cause confusion and disappointment for Democratic voters.
Thank you so much. Yeah. I'm wondering if anyone else has some questions.
What do you see as in the short term? What's going to happen in the midterms due to the current set of changes with regard to Congress?
Mhm. Great question. So it's looking honestly like the overall swing is potentially going to be a wash in terms of what should I say? It'll be a wash in terms of the number of districts that have actually been directly affected. So like I said, Texas and California have essentially canceled one another out. So that's probably we're not going to see a lot of changes we'll see changes in those specific states' substantive representation. We won't see changes, though, in the control of the House majority. Now, the one thing I should mention, though, is that again, in redistricting, people in power at the state level have to be very careful in creating extremely competitive districts. So you might see, there's a term called dummy mandering, where potentially there's a backfire effect, where you've accidentally made a district more competitive by putting more of your opponent's voters in that district. If there is an anticipated blue wave, large sort of blue voter, Democratic voter enthusiasm come this fall, you could see that those districts that were thought to be soft, safe Republican districts actually end up becoming more competitive because Democratic turnout is going to be that much higher in November of 2026.
And I had another question, or just to make sure I understand this. So we only have two Black congressmen in Florida, even though we have 16-17% of the population.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if
Yes,
you look
yes,
at
that is correct.
Louisiana, they have 35% Black, and they have about 35% congressional representatives, as far as I
Mhm.
can tell. So it's, I mean, how long do you put up with this before?
Yeah, it's a
Um,
great question. I think there's there's the potential here that the Republican Party here in Florida will exercise some restraint, being that there might be large voter backlash, especially come 2026. Now, the problem being is that voters have to be paying attention first and foremost to the fact that there is a special redistricting session. Voters tend to not be paying attention to state politics, generally speaking, so it's possible that many of these Florida Republicans that might have an ideological hesitancy to engage in the redistricting wars might feel like they have a bit of political coverage because they're not going to be up for election at the same time as these House members. So there are questions there about whether or not people feel that this is a system that has political integrity or not. Mhm. Yeah.
And so, can you talk a little bit more about that juxtaposition between Section 2, which is protecting the dilution of Black voters, and then the 14th Amendment, and how those kind of actually they kind of like conflict or almost opposites completely. So,
Yeah, they really do. I'm going to pull up my slides again so I can share the direct conflict as you've identified there, Annalise. Let's see. Hopefully it'll jump with me. Here we go.
And then Jaden, we'll have you go next with your question after this. Thank you.
Yes, so I'm so glad that you brought up this potential tension. There is a major tension here between the 14th Amendment, which we know is a Reconstruction Amendment. It was passed after the Civil War to try and re-enfranchise, or excuse me, newly enfranchise Black voters. And so this says that states should not draw maps where race is the predominant factor. If a state draws a map where race is the predominant factor, the Supreme Court in the past has ruled that it has to have an exceptionally compelling reason to do so. Usually that is to redress past harms, but we know that the Supreme Court has been slowly weakening the Voting Rights Act over the last 10 or so years. And then Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, 1965, says that states should not draw maps that effectively deny the right of minority voters a fair chance to elect a candidate of their choice. Now, that implies that states should be really mindful of keeping the political integrity of specific majority-minority districts in place. Now, there's a three-prong rule that the Supreme Court in the past has applied to interpret the constitutionality of Section 2. So let's say that a state legislature wants to draw or maintain the integrity of a majority-minority Black district. There's three specific prongs to say whether or not the state has a compelling reason to do so. The first one is there a majority, so 50% or more of minority voters in that district? So some districts are not going to rise to 50%. For example, Florida's 5th district used to only be something like 42 or 46% Black voters. So that would not qualify as having a compelling interest to protect that district. The second prong has to do with whether or not the minority voters in that district actually have voted historically in a cohesive way. So we talk about how just because you have voters of color or voters of a certain linguistic background or voters of a certain religious background living in the same district doesn't necessarily mean that they're all going to be voting for the same political candidates. So the Supreme Court is asking, can you demonstrate that the voters would generally be interested, the minority voters in a district would generally be interested in voting in the same direction for the same political candidates? If so, we might say that that provides us with a compelling interest in protecting those voters. So that's sort of the standard that the Supreme Court has used for enforcing Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. We know that racial gerrymandering to harm minority voters is unconstitutional. The question now, though, on the table this year, and hopefully we'll get an answer by the end of the Supreme Court session in June, is whether or not you can use Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act to protect the integrity of the districts of those majority-minority voters. I hope that answers your question, Analiz.
Yes, great. Thank you. And then Jaden, I believe you had your hand up.
Yeah, I have a question. It's not about the presentation. I have a question about Analiz, I think. How old are you?
Can I answer any questions about voting or state politics?
No.
Okay, great. Thank you. So any other questions that actually pertain to redistricting and the possible effects? Maybe perhaps how age plays an effect on voting.
I have a question. This is more so, you talked about was it dummy mandering? And I was wondering if just because, I guess more recently elections have, at least in the general elections, have been more flip-flopped between Democrats winning and then Republicans winning and going back and forth. I was wondering if this kind of trend continues, do you think that states will redistrict just like going back and forth, like depending on one year's outcome, they'll change it, and then in the next general election, they realize that, oh, maybe this was a mistake or something like that, and then they go back to the previous one or update it? I was just wondering about that.
Yeah, that is a fantastic question. I think there certainly is the potential for more frequent redistricting at the state level. Now that we've seen that some state lawmakers across states have a willingness to continue to redistrict in this way, again, like I said, this is not a typical situation where redistricting is being weaponized in favor of one political party over another for federal political gain. I do think there is the potential that we see more frequent mid-decade redistricting as a result of the sort of opening of the floodgates. The one thing I would say, though, is that not every state has the ability to redistrict as frequently. So some states have constitutional provisions that actually prevent the state legislature from participating in mid-decade redistricting. So that is one option. If a state is dissatisfied with the frequency of redistricting, they could potentially pass guardrails into their state constitution. The other thing is not every state redistricts in the same mechanical way. So for example, Texas and Florida, it's just a simple majority that's needed in both chambers of the state legislature in order to redistrict mid-decade. But in a state like California, California actually has an independent redistricting commission. And historically, that commission has been in place to try and prevent stuff like partisan gerrymandering from occurring. Now, the unexpected thing, though, was that California voters last November actually overwhelmingly voted to override their Independent Redistricting Commission's original 2020 map in order to put in place this new +5 Democratic seat map. So that was a bit unexpected, I think, for political scientists, that voters would be willing to actually override the guardrails that they had already put in place to prevent partisan gerrymandering. But to your overall point, I absolutely think that this is the potential future that we have. This might be our new political reality, where you do see a lot of flip-flopping of districts on a almost a house race to house race basis. So every 2 years, you could end up with a new district. I do think at some point, though, people will get tired of it.
I wonder too if, well, we have Amendment 10, which allows the states to determine it gives them the ability to have all of these different rules when it comes to redistricting, like independent redistricting commissions and things like that. But I wonder if with that flip-flopping back and forth, if you're aware of any groups that would advocate for like a national redistricting standard, like a standard like that, and if so, what would that? I mean, I know it's speculation, but what do you think that would entail?
Yeah, that's a great question. So currently, all the Constitution requires is that states consider passing new maps in order or every 10 years in proportion with however many House seats you gain or lose in the decennial census. The only group I'm aware of that's looking, or perhaps they're two related groups. There's something called the Gerrymander Project that is interested in stopping districts from looking really wonky or really sprawled across the state. So that's not necessarily a project that is interested or invested in stopping from regular redistricting or regular gerrymandering, but they are interested in trying to keep districts as compact geographically as possible. So you could see them moving into a space where they're trying to keep the gerrymandering or the redistricting process as politically neutral or fair as possible. But they're really the only organization I know of that's doing this on a nationwide basis. If you wanted to impose some sort of federal redistricting standard, I think you could, similar to how we talk about in our UNF classes, the principle of one person, one vote. That was a federal ruling from the Supreme Court system back in 1964 with Westbury v. Sanders. So it's possible that courts could also mandate some sort of universal redistricting principles, but it would take a pretty massive hurdle to try and impact 50 state constitutions all at once.
And speaking of those principles, I know that one person, one vote you've just said was confirmed by the Supreme Court, ruled on that. But what about the other four common principles? Are those also included? Like, is there a Supreme Court ruling on, contiguousness and compactness and things like that?
Yeah, great question. So to loop in everyone else here, the sort of 5 most common principles of redistricting in state constitutions as we currently have in 2026 is they have to be contiguous, so they have to all parts of the district have to touch in some fashion. They have to be compact. They have to have equal population sizes. That's a federal mandate. Ideally, they're going to be respectful of political boundaries, so political jurisdictions. We try not to cut counties into multiple congressional districts. We try not to cut states into multiple congressional districts. And then lastly, some state constitutions actually require that the state legislature be respectful of communities of interest. Oftentimes, those are communities of color. In the North and the Northeast, those tend to be religious minority communities. So if you have a district where there's a particular high concentration of, say, Jewish voters or of Muslim Americans, we want to also be respectful to not dilute the vote of those communities. To your question, though, Analiz, I am only aware of the one person, one vote being a required federal statute. Yeah. You would think that at least contiguity would be a federal mandate, but as far as I'm aware of, it is not. But I'm not a con law scholar, so I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you so much. And does anyone else have any questions about redistricting?
What do you see as the
Or
long?
perhaps any opinions as well?
Oh, can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Oh, yeah. So just what do you see as the long-term impact of this, particularly in Florida? Is it, I get the impression that it's going to be very difficult for Democrats to ever get a hold again.
Yeah, I do think it's going to be pretty tricky. I think the fact that Florida is quickly growing as a state probably means that it's going to be like Texas. It's going to be gaining House seats in future decennial censuses. So there's a chance that the number of districts in Florida gets so voluminous that the creation of majority minority districts is almost unintentional, but also unavoidable. So you could see areas like it's going to be really difficult to potentially partisan gerrymander entirely the area of Miami. The other thing I should mention, though, is that, and this goes to the sort of the prong test that the VRA applies, or that the Supreme Court has applied with the VRA, is that just because you have voters of color, like let's say Hispanic voters or Cuban voters in South Miami, does not necessarily mean that they'll be consistently voting with one political party or another. So what this might mean is that the state political parties here in Florida have to change their strategies of the types of voters they're trying to attract to the voter coalition. Just because you redistrict South Miami in such a way that it leans Republican, like we did in the last redistricting cycle when I believe it was Val Demings lost her seat, does not mean, though, that those voters are going to consistently be voting for one political party over another. So if you're a Florida Democratic strategist, I would think figuring out a way to attract to the coalition historically more conservative or moderate Latinos in South Florida might be one way that you can combat the surety of the sort of Republican maps.
That reminds me of another way. I believe a student in our class spoke about how they were trying to counteract the situation by applying, what is it that they put themselves as Republican and then they vote Democrat? Is that how they did that?
Yes, I think what you're referring to is what's known as stealth voting, and I have never heard of it working in any sort of mass sense, but the idea being that people who might be in a state where there's a political supermajority or partisan supermajority, like in Florida, where it doesn't seem like the Democratic Party is going to return to power anytime soon here in the state legislature. The idea being that if you're a Democratic voter, knowing that your party is has not a lot of hope, at least within the next 10 years, you re-register to belong to the other political party in order to then stealth vote in their political primary and potentially impact or encourage moderation in the Republican Party primary. I've never heard of this working on a mass level. I think as for college students, though, I think this is an awesome idea, and this is the great part about the laboratories of democracy where you can experiment. If this works, that's great. I think it would do a lot of good, especially as the trifecta status of state political parties is going. the trifecta status, excuse me, of state political parties is just expanding. So Texas seems like it's hopelessly red. California seems like it's
What
hopelessly
the fuck are
blue.
you
So
talking about?
this might be a way to combat sort of that trifecta issue that we have here on the national level.
Okay, all right.
Sorry.
Thank you so much. I believe we've only got 2 minutes left. Thank you for presenting. The presentation was amazing, as always, with your class. If anyone has any final comments that they'd like to add, if not, I want to say thank you so much for everyone attending. I know that I think we've just lost a couple of us in wrapping up, but thank you so much. And I appreciate you for coming and your time, especially on your spring break,
Yeah.
to talk to us about such an important issue like this.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm going to just pop my email again in the chat so that way if anybody wants to talk to me offline or has any interest in talking more about state and local politics, I'm certainly happy to do so. I'll also say that we should all be writing our state lawmakers more often. They are so local to the people. They get very little attention as is. And so I think when in doubt, it's always an important thing to try and reach out to your state lawmakers as they are, unlike I think oftentimes it feels like it's hard to impact federal politics. State politics is really something where I think especially young people can have a significant impact.
All right,
Well,
great. Thank you so much.
on behalf of the Jacksonville Urban League and the Center for Advocacy and Social Justice here, I want to thank you, Analiz, and the other interns who made this happen this evening. We will be posting this after a little editing onto YouTube, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of interest in this video. So thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity.
All right, have a great weekend,
Have a
guys.
great
Thank you so
weekend, everyone.
much.
A great evening.
Bye.